Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Russian Revolution Area of Study 1. In this video, we will be exploring the 1905 revolution and specifically the causes of the 1905 revolution, with a little bit about the revolutionary activity that happened in 1905 as well, and a brief slide on one of the consequences of the 1905 revolution. So this video outlines the years 1896 to 1905, with a particular focus on 1904 to 1905. So first of all, let's have a look at the key knowledge that this video relates to. Firstly, we've got I haven't highlighted it, but it's definitely relevant. So the events and conditions that contributed to the outbreak of revolution, including institutional weaknesses and tensions in Tsarist Russia, economic and social inequalities, the Russo-Japanese War, Bloody Sunday, and the October Manifesto. We'll also explore the ideas that played a significant role in challenging the existing order, including discontent with Tsarist autocracy and liberal ideas and reforms. We'll look at the role of the Tsar in maintaining his power, and we'll explore the contribution of popular movements in mobilizing society and challenging the existing order, including workers' protests and peasants' uprisings, and soldier and sailor mutinies. So all of those key knowledge points will be either directly or indirectly mentioned in this video. First, let's talk about increased industrialization as a long-term cause of the 1905 revolution. So Sergei Witt, this gentleman here with a fabulous beard, was one of the most influential ministers of the Tsarist regime in the government of both Tsar Alexander III, who was Nicholas's father, and Nicholas II. Before Alexander died, he told Nicholas to, quote, listen to Witt. He knew that Witt was an important statesman and politician and ally, and he also knew that Nicholas was probably not ready to be Tsar, and so Witt was going to be a great support to him. Witt was appointed Minister of Finance in 1893, still during the reign of Alexander III, and he initiated a program of rapid industrialization known as the Great Spurt. The Great Spurt brought in lots of foreign investment it improved Russia's heavy industry enormously. Now, before the initiation of the Great Spurt, in 1891, the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway began, which was designed to connect the isolated regions of central and eastern Russia, which were rich in resources, with the emerging industrial centers in the west, such as St. Petersburg and Moscow. The railway, however, was not completed until 1916, which is 1 year before the end of Nicholas's reign. Witt's reforms, known as the Great Spurt, developed Russia's industry enormously, but it also relied on foreign investments, developed heavy industry while also making little for Russian consumers. So all of the industrial output was going towards exports and not on regular people in Russia. The reforms failed to improve the livelihoods of workers and peasants, and led to high interest rates, rising prices, and increased taxes on goods. So ultimately, while Russia's economy improved, the economic and social situation for everyday people got much worse. Now, due to the famine crisis and poverty, many peasants flocked to Russia's industrial centers in search of work. So much so that the industrial labor force tripled between 1860 to 1905. Living and working conditions were not very good, which increased social tensions in the cities. This is demonstrated through the fact that the number of industrial strikes that was suppressed by military force increased from 19 in 1893 to 522 in 1902. I don't know what percentage of an increase that is, but it's a lot. So over those 10 years, industrial strikes increased. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. So Russia had its Pacific Fleet based at Port Arthur in China, and they secured a 25-year lease of Port Arthur in 1898. They wanted, however, to expand and take control of Manchuria, where they wanted to extend the Trans-Siberian Railway. However, Japan was also interested in this region and looked to negotiate with Russia. Russia, underestimating Japan, was not interested in diplomacy, and many figures in the Tsarist government actually welcomed a war with Japan. The internal minister, V.K. Plev, when speaking to a critic of the Russo-Japanese War, said, quote, "You are not familiar with Russia's internal situation," i.e. the increase in industrial strikes. "We need a little victorious war to stem the tide of revolution." So basically, by going to war with Japan, and winning that war, because they really did underestimate Japan, that would increase nationalism and patriotism and increase support for the Tsar. And to try and put an end to the revolutionary situation in Russia itself. Now, after failed negotiations, which Russia purposefully did not participate in effectively, the Japanese Imperial Navy launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur on the 8th of February 1904, beginning the Russo-Japanese War. The declaration of war was followed by a prolonged siege of Port Arthur, which Russia eventually surrendered to the Japanese on the 2nd of January 1905 after losing 31,000 men in a futile defense of the port. Here is a summary diagram of the war. So a few causes. Firstly, Russian expansionism. They wanted to expand into Manchuria for the Trans-Siberian Railway. They also needed an ice-free port. So as we've just found out, increased industrialization led to high exports of their industrial output. And Russia also exported grain and other agricultural products. But the ports that they had froze over in winter. Russia is incredibly cold, and they were unable to export at the level that they wanted to during the winter months. So they needed an ice-free port so that they could export all year round, and that was Port Arthur for them. The Tsarist regime also wanted to distract from home problems, as that quote from V.K. Plev suggests. The course of the war. So Port Arthur fell to Japan in January 1905. Russia surrendered at the Battle of Mukden in February 1905. The Battle of Mukden took place between the 11th to the 25th of February 1905. It was fought on land, and there were 90,000 Russian army casualties. The most devastating loss for Russia was the Battle of Tsushima, where the entire Baltic fleet was destroyed in May 1905. So this is an interesting story. The Baltic fleet was one of the most formidable navy fleets in all of Europe at this time, but they were stationed in St. Petersburg. And so in order to get to Port Arthur, where they were going to provide support against the siege, the Baltic fleet left St. Petersburg on October 1904. Now, to get from St. Petersburg to Port Arthur in China, they needed to go around Europe, down the west coast of Africa, up the east coast of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, all the way up to Port Arthur. That journey took 7 months to complete, by which point Port Arthur had already been surrendered to Japan just 2 months into their journey. So 5 months after the port had already been surrendered, they arrived. And the Japanese Navy, which was highly underestimated, completely destroyed the Baltic Fleet in less than 24 hours. Russia lost all of its battleships and over 10,000 men, whereas Japan lost 117 men. So it was a humiliating loss. Russia ended up surrendering in the Russo-Japanese War, and the outcome was the loss of Manchuria, Korea, and Port Arthur to Japan. Now, there are multiple reasons that Russia lost. They, as I've mentioned, underestimated the Japanese army and navy. The Russian command planned the attacks inadequately. They had poor strategy, and Japan was far more ready and skilled and spirited than the Russian army had expected. The impacts of the Russo-Japanese War. So after the Battle of Tsushima, Tsar Nicholas sent Sergei Witt to negotiate a peace settlement. This was signed on the 23rd of August, 1905, and it's known as the Treaty of Portsmouth. In Russia, people were humiliated. They were embarrassed. Japan was meant to be this weak Asian nation versus this strong, powerful European superpower. And so discontent really grew over the embarrassing and humiliating defeats on both land and sea. And the national embarrassment of the Russo-Japanese War helped to create conditions for revolution by late 1905. Also, it should be noted that soldiers and sailors were war weary. They weren't pleased with this seemingly pointless war, and so that led to discontent among soldiers and sailors as well. Bloody Sunday. So that was the Russo-Japanese War. We've looked at two causes: increased industrialization and the Russo-Japanese War. Bloody Sunday was a very significant event in terms of causing the 1905 revolution. So in December 1904, 4 steel workers were dismissed from the Putilov Steel Works. And this, while seeming like not a big deal, 4 steel workers, this was the triggering event for a strike of 120,000 workers. Father Georgy Gapon, who was a prominent member of the St. Petersburg workers' community, decided to present the workers' grievances in a petition to the Tsar. This petition was accompanied by a peaceful march of workers and their families to the Winter Palace, seeking justice and protection from their little father. Remember that the Tsar is referred to as the people's little father, because he's meant to be this strong but nurturing leader. Not so for Tsar Nicholas. On Sunday, 9th of January, 1905, Gapon led the procession with the petition to the Winter Palace, but thousands of soldiers had been deployed to prevent the march from reaching the Winter Palace. Officers shouted at the workers to disperse, but the crowds continued on, resulting in shots being fired into the crowds. Around 200 people were killed and 400 more were injured, including women and children, as it was both workers and their families. And so this event became known as Bloody Sunday. Tsar Nicholas was not present in St. Petersburg on Bloody Sunday, nor did he order his troops to fire, but the authority of the Tsar was absolute, and he was therefore seen as ultimately responsible. The Tsar became popularly known as Bloody Nicholas. So if you'll remember from, I think it was our first video, Nicholas already had the nickname Nicholas the Bloody after the Kadinka Field tragedy, where he chose to attend a party at the French embassy instead of visiting people who were wounded by this stampede during his coronation. And so he'd already started off on the back foot, being referred to as Nicholas the Bloody. After Bloody Sunday, he was referred popularly as Bloody Nicholas. Worker strikes increased after Bloody Sunday to the point that there were 400,000 workers protesting in St. Petersburg by the end of January. Now, here are a couple of visual sources. The first one here shows a figure lying on the ground holding a petition to the deathly Tsar, who is sitting, not paying any mind to the petition lying in front of him and the dead man lying in front of him. It's a little bit pixelated, so I apologize for that. The second one shows Father Georgi Gapon leading the workers and their families with the Tsarist troops in the distance there. So that brings us to the 1905 revolution. So there were multiple groups involved in the period that has become known as the 1905 revolution. So starting with the workers, as I mentioned, by late January, over 400,000 workers were on strike in St. Petersburg, and industrial action was taking place in every major town and city. Throughout 1905, industrial action never stopped. The strikes never stopped. And so remember as well that trade unions and strikes were actually illegal, but they continued nonetheless. So workers were a key revolutionary group. Peasants, the unrest in the cities actually spread to the countryside. Peasants defied local officials. They refused to pay taxes. They seized crops of landowners. They plundered estates and burned down manor houses. So these peasant uprisings were taking place in the countryside, while at the same time, worker strikes were taking place in the cities. University campuses became, according to historian Orlando Fage, centers of political agitation. So students were also becoming quite revolutionary and rebellious. Red flags to indicate the left-wing radical groups such as the Bolsheviks hung around campuses. Students burned a portrait of the Tsar, and in March 1905, the government ordered all educational institutions to cancel classes for the rest of the year. Soldiers and sailors. So I already mentioned when talking about the war weariness of the Russian soldiers and sailors during the Russo-Japanese War, how that increased discontent with the regime. But just to elaborate, poor conditions and war weariness led to this discontent. And the greatest example of this is on the 14th of June, 1905, the mutiny on the battleship Potemkin. So sailors turned on their officers after they were served rotten meat, and this was a display of discontent by soldiers and sailors. And why is this significant? Well, because soldiers and sailors, they have guns. The workers in the cities, the peasants in the countryside, they can go and strike and they can have uprisings, but they're unarmed. Whereas soldiers and sailors, once you get them involved in revolutionary action, they can support the revolution with actual firearms. And finally, we've got the liberals. So the Union of Liberation and the Union of Unions, which you should look into in a little more detail in your textbook, were groups of the professional middle classes and intelligentsia. And they demanded universal suffrage and representative democracy. So they wanted liberal reforms, and they were centered around liberal ideas. And these liberal groups cropped up during the 1890s and continued into the 1900s. And even though they were just sort of asking nicely for these liberal reforms, that coupled with all the other far more feet on the ground revolutionary activity happening elsewhere, put a lot of pressure on the Tsarist regime. Now, there were also revolutionary groups such as the SRs, Mensheviks, and Bolsheviks who were active in leading strikes and mobilizing demonstrations in 1905. The SRs, as we found out from our last video, carried out terror attacks. In our last video, we mentioned that between 1901 to 1905, 2,000 Tsarist officials were assassinated by socialist revolutionaries. And in 1905, the SRs killed Tsar Nicholas's uncle, Grand Duke Sergei, in February. On the 13th of October 1905, the St. Petersburg Soviet of Workers' Deputies was founded and led mostly by Mensheviks. This was the first of many Soviets, and Soviets acted as workers' councils, sort of like unions and support for whereby workers could have some say and act democratically to represent the workers. And these Soviets soon sprang up in other cities such as Kiev and Moscow. So one day after the St. Petersburg Soviet of Workers' Deputies was founded, the Soviet called a nationwide general strike. Workers from all walks of life went on strike, not just factory workers, but also teachers and clerks and other professional middle-class workers as well, which brought all the major cities to a halt. Strikers numbered at least 1.5 million people, making it the largest mass industrial action that Russia had ever seen. So things had really reached a boiling point by the 14th of October, 1905. This demonstrated that the Tsarist regime was in danger of collapsing. So facing the potential collapse of his regime, Tsar Nicholas, as he had been suggested to do by his late father, Alexander III, looked to Sergei Witt for a solution. He listened to Witt. Witt advised that significant reform was required to bring peace and order to the empire. Tsar Nicholas wasn't too happy. He hoped to maintain the autocracy in the same way that his father had, while also being an incredibly weak leader. But he did concede, and Witt drafted the October Manifesto, which was a document which outlined the proposed reforms, democratic and liberal reforms. Nicholas accepted these terms, and on the 17th of October 1905, the manifesto was proclaimed. 3 major reforms were granted, or at least promised, in the October Manifesto. The first one was civil liberties, including freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association. The second was the creation of an elected and legislative parliament known as the Duma. And the third was the agreement that all state laws must pass through the Duma. So, as you can imagine, the liberal groups, the liberal reformist groups, were very pleased with this outcome. This sounded fantastic to them. And 2 parties that we looked at in our last video, the Cadets and the Octoberists, came about as a result of this. So the October Manifesto sort of brought an end to the 1905 revolution. Now, here is a historical interpretation by Leon Trotsky. It's quite long, so I've highlighted some of the key points. He said the events of 1905 were a prologue to the 2 revolutions of 1917, that of February and that of October. In the prologue, all the elements of the drama were included, but not carried through. The Russo-Japanese War had made Tsarism totter. Against the background of a mass movement, the liberal bourgeoisie had frightened the monarchy with its opposition. The workers had organized independently into Soviets, a form of organization then first called into being. Peasant uprisings to seize the land occurred throughout vast stretches of the country. However, all the revolutionary forces were then going into action for the first time, lacking experience and confidence. The liberals demonstratively backed away from the revolution exactly at the moment when it became clear that to shake Tsarism would not be enough. It must be overthrown. Although with a few broken ribs, Tsarism came out of the experience of 1905 alive and strong enough. So what he's saying is that the 1905 revolution was an unsuccessful revolution. It was a prologue to the successful revolutions of 1917. And even though Tsarism and the Tsar himself was sort of battered and bruised, not in a physical sense, but in a mental and metaphorical sense, Tsarism did survive the 1905 revolution. So that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you found it interesting and useful, and I will see you next time.